Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bahjah Bakta. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to second session of 6th-year conference on human rights. It is my pleasure to be here as a moderator for this session. The program of this conference is followed by DPP of University Gadjah Mada, the Center of Human Rights, Multiculturalism and Migration, the University of Sydney, Westminster Foundation for Democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, I will inform that this session will discuss about authoritarianism, human rights, and technology. And I want to highlight that your activity in this session is required. So please don't hesitate to ask something on a Q&A session. Today, I also want to ensure to all speakers that you have 15 minutes to each presenting the proposal, and after all of you finish, we will have Q&A and discussion. Today we have 4 speakers, and I will introduce one by one to you guys. One is Indigenizing the Technological State, Predatory Politics and Digital Violence in Indonesia by Pradipa Rasidi. And the second is the 1974 Malisbong Massacre, Censorship and Survival of Human Rights Violation Narrative by Lorenzo Martinez. And the third is The Killing of Samar, Counterinsurgency and Human Rights Violation under the Marcos Dictator by Aaron Famous. And fourth is Academic Freedom and its Movement in Indonesia Digital Authoritarianism by Herlambang Perdana Wiratraman, represented by co-author Satria, Unggul, Wicaksana, Prakasa. And for the speakers, please to sit down in front of us right now. Yes. Yeah. Before we start the presentation, maybe I will read the short biography from the presenter today, from Bapak Pradipa Rasidi. Is a digital anthropology who has conducted research on influence, operation, and algorithm relation, with a particular interest in the forms of imagination and belongings that emerge when individuals inhabit the in-between. His research on bazaars and rumors has been published in academic journals such as HAU, Journal of Ethnographic Theory, 2022, Communication Culture and Critique, 2023, and ISEA's Perspective, 2021-2022 in Press. And currently, he serves as the Digital Rights and Research Project Coordinator Indonesia for Engage Media, a non-profit dedicated to digital rights, open technology, and video documentaries in the Asia Pacific region. And the second speaker is Lorenzo Martinez. Yeah. He's a teaching associate at the Department of History in the University of the Philippines, Diliman. Previously, he served for more than 3 years in the Human Rights Violation Victims Memorial Commission, HRWVMC, as a history researcher and officer in charge for research and education. Under the HRWVMC, he helped conduct oral historiography training and field activists in Sultan Kudarat and Samar, as well as organize and proofread information published on the HRVVMC's educational materials. And the third speaker today is Aaron Viernes. The short bio is Aaron is an instructor at the Department of History of the University of the Philippines. He obtained his BA and MA degrees in history from the same university. His master thesis is titled Examining Human Rights Violation under the Marcos Dictatorship, Case Studies from Samar. He also worked as a consultant to the Human Rights Violation Victims Memorial Commission from 2017 to 2019. His research interests are human rights, martial law studies, and sport history. And also Pak Herlambang Perdana Wiratraman. This actually there is no surprise here, sir, but I'm glad that. Oh yeah, okay. Okay, thank you. I think that's a very brief short view that I can tell. Okay, thank you so much. And yeah, I will start from the first speakers today is Bapak Pradipa, and the time is yours.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and also thank you for having me in this very prestigious conference. So I'm Pradipa. My education is anthropology and political science from University of Indonesia. I'm currently working as a research coordinator for Engage Media, and this is the title of my slide. This exploration will be about political buzzers, my main research interest, but also a little bit more than that. But this paper is still very much in development. It's still a bit of all over the places, still very preliminary. So please, I really appreciate the feedback. Okay. So my paper will be about responding to discussion on digital authoritarianism. Since Freedom House used this label several years ago, I think it's been very widely used everywhere. Writers, scholars, analysts, everyone have tied this concept of digital authoritarianism in Indonesia in particular to the notion of authoritarian turn or democratic regression to explain the erosion of democratic institution in Indonesia since 2017. So, so their focus mostly have been on civil and political rights, which is why the discussions on digital authoritarianism usually revolve around digital attacks on journalists, internet shutdown, disinformation, and the use of influencers and cyber troops or trolls or buzzers in Indonesia. So what I aim to bring to the table, hopefully, is to question this, well, perhaps to provide another perspective on the growing trend on digital authoritarianism. So I want to ask two things. The first is there truly a digital authoritarianism in Indonesia? Is the concept useful to explain the development in Indonesia? Because what I want to ask is whether the previous discussion is sufficient. Of course, the previous literature have mentioned important and also have contributed importantly to the issue on digital attacks, freedom of press, and etc. But what makes digital authoritarianism really digital? Why is it a digital authoritarianism and not a usual authoritarianism? Because most writing usually have mentioned the use of digital technology to consolidate power. Also how the state have used laws, regulations, surveillance involved in digital technology, control behavior online. But those usually put the digital component only in the background, not in the foreground. It's very civil and political rights oriented. So meanwhile, if we examine the writings on digital authoritarianism, they use it to analyze Chinese and Russian state practices, focusing on the digital infrastructure itself. So less about the legal instruments and more about the digital architecture, digital infrastructure. For example, when they discuss the literature on China, discuss Silk Road, Digital Silk Road initiative, also when they compare Chinese high-tech authoritarianism with Russian low-tech authoritarianism. So the focus is actually about political economy instead of civil and social, civil and political rights. Also, the second question is it really an authoritarian turn instead of something that have been progressing in the long run? So my question is, I was wondering if has been a liberal democracy in Indonesia before the phase that we call now as an authoritarian turn. Is it a turn if we had never been turning to democracy? What I want to offer here is to indigenize the concept of the state in Indonesia, quote unquote, indigenize, as in acknowledging the knowledge, skills, and beliefs people have about themselves in their constitution of state practices. So I take state not as a singular entity, also it's not a fragmentary, but as a contentious contingent character, based on approach from anthropology of the state, where the state becomes an entity produced both locally and externally, even when the people involved are quite distant from the power centers, to quote Bouchard. So the state is composed not only of government officials, but also interaction between kelurahan officials and citizens, also private militias like Muda Pancasila, also in this case political buzzers. So I would like to foreground those two concepts I'm using here. First is the technological state proposed by Zulfikar Amir. So the state actors have a strong, you can see the definition there. Basically, the idea proposed that the state actors have a strong belief in pursuing technological development and propagate the narrative of technological development, not only because it contributes economically, but because the belief of technological supremacy, that technological supremacy will bring economic well-being. So there is a huge amount of techno-optimism in the notion of technological state. But it's not enough because the notion is not really historically conscious. So I also bring forth the concept of predatory politics by Mudofir, Abdul Mughis Mudofir, to discuss, to explain why militias and predatory politics are so prevalent in Indonesia, because they are not an anomaly, but because they are very integral to it in Indonesia resource accumulation and capitalist development. We will get into this later. So these are the two cases I will mention briefly to illustrate the argument that I want to bring forth. That first is the normalization of Ciliwung forced eviction and reclamation forced eviction back in 2015 and 16. Also the deterring of protests against Gojek, the ride-hailing company, tariff policies also in the same year. So this is my main method of primary data collection. I talk to buzzers, interview them, and see how they interact and being interacted with in the online spaces. So I think most of us have heard about political buzzers here, but to give a short review, buzzers are basically influence operators in Indonesia. They propagate message to make a certain opinion visible and becomes dominant and becomes look as natural as possible. But I'd also like to highlight here that in my definition, buzzers, whether a buzzer is being paid or not is not relevant as long as they contribute or participate directly in the campaign and coordinate with the team in the campaign, because many buzzers are not really being paid or being paid in another kind of compensation, like being appointed as commissioner or other incentives. This is just a quick review. How do the structure of operation of buzzers look like? Basically, they have a pyramid scheme, pyramid model. At the top is the coordinator or the strategist. They coordinate the campaign and they develop the strategy. And besides or below them is the content creator and research team who provide every materials. And then they have people who operate influencer accounts and also Sokpapat accounts. They have three buzzing patterns. The one is a positive buzzing. This one is where people, the buzzers only propagate a positive quote unquote message supporting the issues they bring up. And negative buzzing is when they counter and they debate and argue with others but they do not resort to harassment or they do not resort to disinformation. And the last one, the black ops buzzing, special ops buzzing, is where they resort to disinformation, harassment, doxings, and other things that we usually discuss when discussing buzzer and the disinformation campaign. So I want to go to this point. So I'm aiming to take buzzer as not a very novel phenomenon, but something that is rooted in Indonesian historical experience. So I think everyone here is familiar with the gangs and militia such as Pemuda Pancasila, Front Pembela Islam, also FBR from Forum Betawi Rempuk. So many literature on privatized violence in Indonesia have highlighted that they are actually not a deviation in Indonesian politics because they are integral in resource accumulations, capitalist accumulations. They are widely deployed in many land grabbing cases, and they are used to externalization of violence beyond the use of formal violence by the state. So if in Weberian assumptions, usually state is the one who monopolize the exercise of violence, in Indonesian case and also in many post-authoritarian cases, militias play a prominent role in conducting violence on behalf of the state actor needs. I argue that buzzers are, this is a photo from a field work I conducted in different year. I argue that buzzers exhibit the same patterns. They are also used in the same way state actors use, political and economic elites use militias. So they are also involved not only in elections as we are seeing right now, but also in many projects such as of Kampung Pulau Force Evictions that we are discussing now, and also Gojek tariff policy. So like the strongmen, the militias, they have authority in spaces that their clients cannot reach. So what I'm trying to say here that because of the nature of Indonesian predatory politics, I think it's not quite apt to say that Indonesia has experienced a liberal democracy, and I'm following Mudofir here that perhaps rather than regression or the authoritarian trend, what we have been seeing now is the historical continuity of Indonesian predatory state practices. So how does technology comes into play in this case? So I will focus on these two cases because they both exhibit the narrative of technological modernity. So this one is from the Ciliwung Force Eviction and Jakarta Reclamation in 2015 and 2016 to refresh the case a little bit. So at those years, the Jakarta government were affecting a lot of urban poor communities. The two of them being the one who settled in Ciliwung Riverside in Jakarta, and the other one is the people who reside in North Jakarta, the fisherman communities. They were being moved, they were affected to be moved to Rusunawa or flat rentals, and the argument that the Jakarta government used to justify the eviction is they want to modernize the urban poor communities into modern housing. The concept of modern housing itself, the notion that one core family living in one room with facilities like AC, air conditioning, and also the concept of renting a room instead of living in a house is a very modern concept, especially when we consider that among urban core communities, one house can inhabit more than one family, core families. So it's extended families usually settle there, but this notion of modernizing the urban poor is a very prevalent narrative back then in 2016 and 2015. And buzzers were deployed to justify this eviction, not only on Jakarta or Ahok government behalf, but also on the Agung Sedayu Group behalf. Agung Sedayu Group is a real estate development company with close connection to Ahok at the time, and they benefit from the forced eviction that happened when Ahok moved the urban poor communities to Rusunawa. I won't discuss it further because it's in Mudovir's book. But the point is that while buzzers were being deployed to normalize this eviction, they are not the only one, because the media, as discussed by Mariani writing, also complement, also fervently promote and support the narrative of technology, housing modernity. There is a speech at the time by Ahok on how we need to make Jakarta orderly and clean to become an advanced nation and negara maju, and it can be achieved when people were affected to the Rusunawa. So that's one aspect of how the technology of space, the narrative of being a modern space were being utilized in Ciliwung case and also reclamation case. And the other one is, the last discussed one, is how similar tactics and similar pattern was also seen during Gojek controversial policies. So at the time, so there were a lot of protests in 2015 and 2016. First, when Gojek became more popular, Gojek were considered as replacing conventional taxis and conventional ojek pangkalan (opang), and there were a lot of protests on that because Gojek was considered as breaching the regulatory frameworks that regulate public transportation. And after those protests, the other protests also followed, this time by Gojek drivers, because they felt that Gojek decreased the bonus and the pay for the drivers, so they came to protest. And again, I talked to the buzzers who were involved in the campaign to delegitimate those protesters. They used the narrative. This is also similar to the Ciliwung and reclamation example, that the narrative of technological progress, technological modernity became very prominent not only in online spaces but also in media, where
1 minute left.
Okay, I'll be fast. Basically, it's the same. There is this interesting quote by oh, okay. I think I lost the slide, but there is one. I'll read it from here. One buzzer said that this is the quote from him. Sorry. This is why Indonesia is a developing nation, because every time there is a change being introduced, people always resist without actually understanding it. This is the age of technological disruption. People only protest because they are not used to it and don't want to make themselves used to it. Even if we need a bloody process, it's a necessary process. So there is, once again, there's a narrative of disruption, of modernity, of technological change used in this resource accumulation. So to conclude quickly, there is a lot of techno optimism, but I don't want to draw any conclusion yet, because this is a very preliminary thoughts and perhaps a way to explore what kind of concept that we can work with beyond digital authoritarianism. I think this is a part of my ongoing project. You can read my other piece here. Okay, I think that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, for the next speaker is Lorenzo Martinez with the title The 1974 Malisbong Massacre, Censorship and Survival of Human Rights Violation Narrative. Anyway, you can stand up or you just can sit.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So selamat siang, good afternoon, everyone. As has been introduced, I'm a teaching associate from the History Department of the University of the Philippines, Diliman. And I'm thankful for the opportunity of presenting today something which I have a personal connection to as a researcher, since this was a topic I began exploring while I was working in the HRVVMC. So it's a government agency which essentially is proof that the Philippine state has recognized it is accountable for human rights atrocities done under the regime of Ferdinand E. Marcos Sr. which also puts me in a bit of a bind given my background and that with the 2022 elections, there was another Marcos which has been elected now as president, and also his namesake, Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. So, oh, is there a clicker? Yeah. Last 2018, so just to premise that, the current president also runs, so to speak, a YouTube channel, and he's branded them as BBM vlogs per se. And part of his channel has also enabled interviews with certain personalities that were involved with his father's regime. Now, 2018, among these examples is Juan Ponce Enrile, who was the former defense minister. And during these interviews on his channel, he mentioned or claimed that no one was massacred under martial law. He was challenging people to name at least one who had been killed in this context. Unsurprisingly, there were a flurry of newspapers and articles which responded to this claim. And one of the consistent incidences that always emerged, or which was always put forward, was the Malisbong massacre of 1974. There are various accounts of this incident which are now publicly available, and the estimates for the number of people who have been killed in this incident have gone to as high as 1,500 Muslim males who were rounded up as part of a military operation and systematically killed in various batches over a period of several days. Now, as I did my research, however, I also found that much of the event's documentation has only appeared to have emerged in the past 20 years or so, and are primarily drawn from the gathering of oral testimonies and the analyses of these same accounts from residents of the community. Now, putting together this presentation, I aim to focus on concepts of historical trauma that may explore this characteristic of the study. And I'd first have to foreground what I would mean by this. So next slide, please. So first I'd have to foreground what I mean by this concept of reticence as pressures which could affect the narrativization of this event. Following that would be a contextualization of the region and outlining sources of interaction and conflict between local populations in Mindanao and also the state at large. And by 1974, it would be found that a myriad of such tensions would shadow the incident or the happening of this incident, prefacing repressive actions of the martial law regime during their inquiry of the military operation then. And with a look at some examples of reticence, I discussed how the established circumstances may have worked against this event being brought to wider public attention. But then I hope to conclude my presentation by reviewing the efforts to push back at this reticence, so to speak, or silences, and to recognize the massacre in the decades that followed the martial law regime. So next slide, please. Now, reticence was a concept that I learned while I read labor historian Lenore Lehman's work on the Perth Power Station. It was defined as a conversational ploy meant to exercise the narrative authority of historical source, particularly of persons giving oral testimonies or sharing personal accounts. She would categorize this in 4 ways. One, as reticence, where interviewees may think that a question asked of them is inappropriate or irrelevant to what they think was the purpose of the interview. Second, that the interviewee may have internalized constraints, perhaps based on cultural norms or conventions that might sanitize the storytelling effort. Third, questions that may touch on personal trauma, which can manifest pain, fear, or embarrassment, the likes of which provoke reticent responses. Or fourth, certain subjects may be counter to public memory or accepted public memory in that respect, which would dissuade interviewees from sharing their experiences. So next slide. Now, with reticence defined, I also wanted to start by contextualizing the region, generally speaking, as one with a trend of land dispossession. Successive administrations from the American colonial government to the post-war Philippine Republic advanced policies that gradually displaced indigenous and Moro peoples from their lands through inward settlement of non-indigenous and oftentimes Christian groups in the Luzon and Visayas regions. Often this was done as a way to alleviate agrarian unrest from these regions, but at its expense, as can be seen, for example, in this image, there is a comparison between the ethnic makeup of peoples in 1903 during the early American surveys to the survey in 1970. The pink bars indicate the number of people who were non-indigenous per se, and we can see that there was a drastic change to that effect, especially in the, well, now present-day makeup of the Barm region, the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region. So unease between these different ethnic groups would also boil under backdrops of wealth inequality and abuse of power. Next slide, please. Now, it's noted that the government led more apparent support towards the settler communities per se, and this was accompanied by an expansion of commercial initiatives, logging and mining enterprises. These would intensify under the old Marcos regime at large, and these tensions would also lead into violent or punitive confrontations between paramilitant groups. We get several which would come up in the lead up to the proclamation of martial law. Marcos, in fact, would use the violence in Mindanao, leaving out the fact that some of this violence was encouraged by their development policies in the region. He'd use it to justify declaring martial law over the Philippines, supposedly to deal with the crisis of violence in the area. So, next slide, please. Now, Muslim communities in Palembang, Sultan Kudarat, at present day, were suspected to possess considerable sympathy for the Moro National Liberation Front, which was the secessionist movement that the government had to fight during the regime. Considerable sympathy, if not outright giving sanctuary to its members. These suspicions were fueled by a series of attacks that were made against employees of an American logging concession that was situated in the area. The concession was given to Weyerhaeuser Logging Corporation, which is based in the US. Oral histories that were later gathered by this company would speak of the growing anxiety of their staff in the area, and notably, these accounts would shed a negative impression of Muslim communities. Most of their staff were employed from the mainly Christian community in Milbuk, so to speak. The United States Embassy in Manila monitored the situation through a Weyerhaeuser source. And while a massacre was not explicitly mentioned in the company's oral histories, the reports of the US Embassy would indicate that they noted the alleged disposal of detainees following military interrogations, and that weeks after, an Associated Press correspondent, Arnold Zeitlin, was sighted in the area, as well as a missionary priest who reportedly saw the execution of detainees on the seashore by armed force personnel. Next slide, please. Now, a press conference was conducted to investigate this matter, and no less than Juan Ponce Enrile also would speak on this matter. And it was declared at that time, this was released on November of the same year, that there was no evidence of a massacre. Various local officials, including the municipal mayor, were recorded to have supposedly supported these findings, saying that the prisoners who were put under military guard during the operation were being well treated. Next slide, please. It is also notable that 2 years after this event, the government banned the same Associated Press correspondent, Arnold Zeitlin, from returning to the Philippines. The Bureau of Immigration declared that he had made a false report, so to speak, regarding what happened in Malisbong, and that although the government investigation found no evidence of a massacre, Zeitlin did not issue a correction. So that was one of the reasons they kept him from returning to the country. And on the following year, Marcos Sr. would reiterate these same findings. As read here, he read of a report of allegedly 300 Muslims, at least, that were disappeared, but they were discovered to have been resettled in another camp. So the official conclusion was. This leads me to a major point, which I found, at least in my current review of this incident. Next slide, please. That a large reason for why the massacre wasn't able to surface into public attention was because of the nature in which the government responded to it at the start. And that being the massacre narrative runs counter to that of the New Society narrative. New Society being the Bagong Lipunan brand that Marcos Sr. sought to paint the martial law regime as. He sought to portray it as a solution to violence, not its chief perpetrator. And insofar as the United States may be concerned, perhaps it was in their best interest in maintaining Marcos's power in opposition to the perceived communist threat or perceived instability from the insurgency crisis. The circumstances of the government's inquiry into the incident would belie its findings to such an effect. One of the informants in that government investigation, we actually interviewed when I was still in the HRVVMC, and he had admitted that he was accosted and berated by an army major during the investigation, and then he was essentially forced to say that the massacre wasn't true. This roughly translates to that account, and it mentions how the person who's presiding the investigation was asking him to just deny that it happened, otherwise he couldn't help him. And he was talking about how there were soldiers everywhere where he was brought to during this inquiry, and he feared for his safety that perhaps he might not be able to return home if he went against their wishes. Now, putting this short, next slide please. There are 4 prominent factors of reticence which I thought could be considered at this moment. First, as mentioned, repression linked to the hegemonic discourse and how it ran counter, so-called, to the massacre narrative. Aside from what was just discussed, perhaps the reaction of warehouse resources might be seen in such a regard, since the embassy noted that they had a very worried reaction about the potential of a massacre having taken place. Not necessarily because of the cost of human lives, but more of if such news of an incident leaked to the press, it would negatively affect their reputation because it happened close to company grounds. The next 2 points, in essence, are around the idea that survivors and victims had to prioritize keeping themselves safe, foremost, perhaps safe rather than seeking justice, immediate justice. The aftermath of such violence, the destruction of community infrastructure and livelihoods can make it extremely difficult to sustain one's own existence, let alone properly record or even process trauma at the onset. It's especially true, as genocide scholar Samuel Toten would point out, in cases where armed groups, such as the perpetrating regime itself, may remain present in the area, as some accounts would uphold. Even then, a remedy which may be sought after, at the last point, may not even be guaranteed or assured, and so there may have been little point to relive traumatic experiences. It was only in the last 10 years or so that the state recognized regime's accountability for human rights violations, and only in those same last several years that peace processes formalized transitional authority for the Bangsamoro region. So, next slide, please. I'll just cycle through the next slides. I'll skip a bit so we can get into the conclusion. So, essentially, I was just outlining that in the end, there were indeed several attempts to push past these reticences and silences, but they had to start first at the local level. These were publications from the now defunct Moro Courier, which was from the Moro People's Resource Center, which I believe was the first news reportage to acknowledge that the massacre took place. And later on in 2010, this was followed by a municipal report, but again, from the municipality of Palembang itself. Much of the research, formal documentation per se, would take place after the state formally recognized its accountability in 2013 through the Human Rights Reparations Act. Next slide, please. And different initiatives would be put to disregard. The Transitional Justice and Reconciliation Commission would put its own report along with the Institute for Bangsamoro Studies, and of course, the state with the support of the presidential advisor of the peace process. So, last slide, I believe. A few quandaries, per se, I am faced with facing the end of the presentation. I would think that studying this case of martial law shows the importance and limits of oral history methods, because on one hand, this gap in history was filled with living memories or experiences of its witnesses, but because of how people first reacted against the massacre narrative per se. It took very long until people felt safe, perhaps, or comfortable to actually share these accounts. And it leads me to different questions that perhaps could be explored in the future on analyzing versus dismissing reticences, that perhaps studying why it took so long and how it relates to historical trauma and how this might also relate to other incidences in the present day may all the more be relevant with how we try to reconcile with our past. And also the question of problematizing physical remains, because the massacre is unique in that it has a very strong indigenous or community memory, but at the same time, formal forensics recovery of the remains is forthcoming. But fortunately, at least from my fieldwork, they have said that they're willing to have the remains formally examined if that is what it would take to lay the question of this incident to rest. So with that, I suppose running short on time, my apologies. Next slide, please. Thank you very much, and never again.
Thank you. Okay, without any further ado, for the third speaker, Viernes, the killing fields of Samar, Counterinsurgency and human rights violation under the Marcos Dictator. The time is yours.
All right, sorry. I'll make this fast. I prepared the script, so hopefully I'll be within the 15-minute time period. Salamat siyang, magandang hapon, good afternoon to everyone. I'm Viernes and an assistant professor from the Department of History of the University of the Philippines. Before I begin, I would like to extend my gratitude to the conference's organizer and to our participants, and I'm deeply honored to be part of this panel. What I would like to share to everyone here this afternoon is a brief contextualization of martial law in the Philippines. So Jem already discussed this earlier in this morning. Kite discussed some parts, so I'll be continuing the discussion. From 1972 to 1986. More significantly, I would like to stress that this presentation would also be an attempt at sharing a local history, particularly of an island in the Philippines named Samar, and focusing on the themes of counterinsurgency, human rights violations, and authoritarianism. Thus, the title of my presentation, Samar's Killing Fields, Counterinsurgency and Human Rights Violations under the Marcos Dictatorship. So why this topic? 50 years since the declaration of martial law in the Philippines, and nearly half a century since the first incidents of killings in Samar, many of the narratives of the victims remains obscure. Most existing literature on human rights violations during the Marcos dictatorship remains wanting. This may have been largely due to the reason that extant historiography on martial law and the Marcos dictatorship often only highlights significant events based on Manila, the capital, or elite-centric narratives which often disregards experiences outside the capital and of the common people. Now, to be able to bridge these gaps, this research locates and analyzes affidavits, reports, and testimonies of witnesses from the archives of the HRVVMC. This makes the task of reconstructing and understanding the incidents of killings in Samar much more possible than it was decades ago. Now, drawing upon these narratives based from the archives, this paper concentrates on the killings in 3 municipalities in Samar, Canavid, Las Navas, and Paranas. In particular, it will examine how many were killed, who they were, how they were killed, and when and where they were killed. More so, this examination would show clearer patterns on how incidents of killings will be uncovered. Likewise, this paper also discusses modalities and patterns of killings in the 3 aforementioned municipalities on the island. A closer look at the killings in these municipalities provide new perspectives on the extent and gravity of abuses under the Marcos dictatorship. In this way, looking into specific cases of killings will also contribute to writing local history during the martial law years. And partly another reason for this research is the current socio-political context in the Philippines. The recent national elections in our country brought to light realities that had long been ignored, particularly on how martial law and the Marcos dictatorship remains to be polarizing topics in the public discourse. Furthermore, the convincing electoral victory of Marcos Sr.'s son, Marcos Jr., who is our president right now, opens up possibility of historical whitewashing, particularly with regards to the brutality and violence experienced during the martial law period. Yet a question remains. How is it that for a people who experience a brutal and violent period in their history would so easily disregard their past and even elect the son of a former dictator? Professor Maria Serena Jokno provides a particularly helpful answer. She explained that Filipinos who have lived through martial law has conflicting memories of the period. Why is it that? Because by employing repression forcefully yet selectively, Marcos was able to spare a large number of Filipinos from the brutality of the period, thus making deniability easy for the perpetrators of the regime. Now, why is this so? Why do we have conflicting memories? As early as his re-election in 1969, Marcos already floated the idea of declaring martial law to save the republic from its enemies. Now, who are these enemies? Aware of the emerging challenges brought by the creation of the new Communist Party of the Philippines in 1968 and the subsequent creation of the New People's Army in 1969, it became imperative for Marcos to adopt a strategy that would not just expand the powers of the executive, but also put him in the best position to face these challenges. While the Communist Party of the Philippines vowed for an armed revolution, Marcos Sr. proposed an alternative, a revolution from the center, a democratic revolution. Aside from this, and in large, martial law also gave Filipinos a false sense of security. News of bombings, students' protests, and the growing communist threat took a toll on the daily life of the people, and the declaration of martial law for many was actually a source of reprieve. Despite fears of repression under martial law, many had a passive attitude about it. Law and order actually became the rallying cry for Marcos, and the people embraced it. Now, with a strong military support, the true character of martial law began to unmask. An observer pointed out that military crackdowns had nothing to do with communists. The imposition of martial law was more of Marcos's strategy to silence his critics and the opposition. Anyone who will speak out against the regime will be labeled as subversive and will be at the mercy of the military. By labeling anyone as subversive, the Marcos dictatorship was able to privatize the regime's brutality. And that through the selectivity of whom will be victimized meant that peace-loving Filipinos were actually spared from the trauma. From here on, we now proceed on how the Marcos dictatorship implemented its counterinsurgency campaign against what is considered as subversive elements. We proceed to Samar. Where is Samar? Samar is actually situated in the eastern part of the Philippines, bordered by the Philippine Sea to the east. The Samar Sea separated it from the island of Masbate, and the San Juanico Strait from Leyte on the west. To its north is the San Bernardino Strait, and to the south is the Leyte Gulf. It is actually the third largest island in the Philippines. The emergence of a strong NPA presence in Samar can likely be attributed to the social conditions on the island. While the initial consideration in the establishment of the NPA in Samar has more to do with the relative ease of organizing, owing to the island's rugged terrain, the NPA was able to gain significant support of the local population, primarily due to the impoverishment and social inequality that pervades the Samar society. During the mid-1970s, the island developed as a key area for the NPA. In 1974, guerrilla units of the NPA successfully launched an offensive against the military. And by 1979, it was reported that the NPA has about 200,000 farmers, or about a fifth of the entire island's population, as its supporters. The increased NPA activity on the island also led to steady militarization. In 1977, a massive military operation known as Oplan Sunrise was launched against the NPA in the island's southern portion. By 1979, 9,000 soldiers were actually distributed in 10 battalions in the island. However, intensified counterinsurgency campaign on the island only pushed people away from the regime's fold as cases of human rights abuses by military personnel increased rapidly. The Committee of Foreign Relations of the United States attributed the expanding base of the NPA to the widespread antagonism against the military, mainly due to the human rights abuses. As the entire island of Samar became the focus of the counterinsurgency campaign, there was a noticeable increase in the reports of human rights abuses. Significantly, the growing number of human rights abuses in Samar from mid-1970s to the 1980s was well documented by the Task Force Detainees of the Philippines. Between 1974 and 1977, two notorious military task forces implemented extensive counterinsurgency campaigns in Samar at the high cost of civilian life. Another thing that we have to point out is the Philippine Constabulary. Now, members also have made name for themselves as one of the most brutal and most dangerous military personnel in Samar. Several members were accused of committing numerous atrocities, including looting, murder, and rape. Arbitrary arrests also ran rampant in the three provinces of Samar. Detention centers became infamous as many of those who were brought were tortured and interrogated. Some who were not as lucky as the others were even forcibly disappeared. Military checkpoints erected across the islands were also often sites of abuses. Now, during the Marcos regime, the military has always been known for its employment of excessive force. Military units conducting counterinsurgency campaign often bludgeon suspected subversive communities into submission. Additionally, the military's search and destroy operations against the NPA often targets innocent civilians who are hardly involved with the NPA. Reports also abound that military personnel often kill civilians on sight. According to the Senate Committee of Foreign Relations of the United States, soldiers actually shoot first and ask questions later during the military operations. Other counterinsurgency strategies employed by the military included zoning, food blockade, and free fire zones. Now, in these following slides, these are the municipalities that I'm talking about, Canavid and Paranas. And this one is in Las Navas. The idea of these municipalities, for Canavid and Paranas, it shows the pervasiveness of killings across a 9-year period. On the other hand, in Las Navas, it actually showcased an incident of extreme brutality where an entire village was actually massacred by military forces. Okay? So this is Canavid, Samar. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Now let's go to the analysis. How many were killed? The records of the killings at the local level are severely lacking, and at best were mere footnotes in the discussion of the killings during the Marcos regime, thus obscuring the fact that killings actually indeed happened. In this light, the intent is to be able to establish and present adequate and foolproof account of the actual figure of killings during the regime and at the same time underscore the figure at the local level. In this case, in the three municipalities I've mentioned. Fortunately, the data on the killings mined through the records allows a clearer picture of the actual figure at the local level. In Canavid and Paranas, there are 23 and 50 individuals killed respectively. In Las Navas, there are around 41 to 45 individuals who were actually massacred. Where were they killed? A composite view of the geographical spread of the killings points out that they are concentrated in the central part of the island of Samar, thus the two municipalities. An analysis of the geographical distribution of the killings in Canavid, Paranas, and Las Navas also offers a micro-level view indicating that the killings were actually concentrated in the interior villages rather than in the centers itself. Testimonies also offer closer insight into where the killings happened. Most of the sites of killings were often farms of the victims, isolated areas such as brooks, plantation clearings, and some public spaces such as community centers and roadsides. Who are the victims? Looking closely at the available data, it appears that most of the victims in both municipalities were unmarried males. The female victims, on the other hand, were mostly married. The youngest victims of the killings is only a few months old, while the eldest is 70 years old. However, nearly half of the persons killed in both municipalities are between the age of 20 and 40 years old. Considerably, 16 victims of the killings have yet to pass their teenage years. More than half the victims are farmers, while the remainders are drivers, fishermen, housekeepers, and laborers. What about the anatomy of the killings? So these are some of the data on those who were killed. So you can see if they were tortured, shot dead, or beheaded. Okay? Looking into all these cases of killings in the three municipalities, different methods were actually used to take the lives of the victims. A significant number of the victims were gunned down using high-powered firearms. Other victims were beaten to their death with punches, kicks, and rifle butts. Some experienced worse as they were burned alive, decapitated, or butchered beyond recognition. Rounding up of victims was also a common practice by the military units. Testimonies of witnesses to the killings indicate that the incidents happened during late-night raids. Nonetheless, there are also several instances where victims of the killings were taken in broad daylight. In some incidents, it appears that the victims were taken by the military as local guides during their patrol operations. So why do they have to take local guides? As Victor Corpus explains, this is largely because of the military's lack of combat intelligence in the counterinsurgency operation. Without knowledge of the local terrain and often unfamiliar with the movement and the disposition of their foe, military units heavily relied on the knowledge of the civilians in the area.
1 minute left.
Oh, so fast. In these cases, it indicates that the victims who are often forced to serve as guides were later found dead with their bodies bearing evidence of heavy beating. Now let's proceed with the reason why there are these killings. Faced with numerous domestic threats in all fronts, Marcos effectively employed the declaration of martial law to eliminate dissent and correspondingly allowed him control of the instruments of coercion, particularly the military. In particular, the expanding threat of the NPA allowed Marcos to unleash a devastating force as a cornerstone of the counterinsurgency campaign. Marcos used the military as a means to restrict civil liberties, which involved shutting down of the critical press and more prominently as a tool to eliminate the opposition by means of force, typically with torture and killing. By employing violent repression, killing in particular, the Marcos regime was able to physically eliminate threat while at the same time warning those who wish to challenge the regime. Okay? Now, largely, the reason why these killings were perpetrated by the military, one can be attributed to the failure of the counterinsurgency strategy in general. So there are many problems with the counterinsurgency campaign of the Marcos government, and in particular, it only focuses on the military approach, no, without actually allowing civilians, no, to properly develop their economies better, no, in the area. Another reason that we can also look into is the lack of military discipline and the repertoire of violence amongst the military. The problem of military discipline or the lack thereof may also be understood in 3 layers. First, the training of military units under the martial regimes is of doubtful quality, both in terms of instructions and conversional warfare. So what does this mean? The services lack standardized training and the government makes no effort to establish training camps. Therefore, most of the soldiers would usually commit mistakes during military operations, leading to abuses and the killings and human rights violations. Another thing, it is also good to point out that the armed forces under the martial law were brutal and brutalized, as it was charged with suppressing dissent. Alarmingly, only few of those who were accused of atrocities were actually convicted. Despite attempts to address grievances against the military, the government's rather half-hearted and often tokenistic effort is not enough. So since then, after the overthrow of the Marcos dictatorship, very few of the military officers who actually committed atrocities were even brought to justice. And in the most recent elections in the Philippines, one of these military officers actually ran for presidency. Okay? And the third layer, which is in most cases is not adequately put into perspective, is the lack of morale amongst the soldiers and the dismal state of the military. The idea during the martial is that Marcos actually funded the military, but most of the funds would only go to units in the capital. So those who are conducting counterinsurgency efforts were actually forced to commit abuses to sustain their campaigns. Okay? And since then, so what happened? There's still no justice. There's still no truth commissions in the Philippines, and there are no reparations. And even though the Hawaii court provided the victims of human rights violations under martial law $2 billion for reparation, they have yet to actually receive half of this actual amount, since most of the payment should be taken from the ill-gotten wealth of the Marcoses, but we have no access to that wealth, so that would be very unfortunate for the Philippines. I hope that we can converse more about this, and thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Okay, for the last speakers is the title is Academic Freedom and Its Movement in Indonesia, Digital Authoritarianism. Will be representing by co-author Bapak Satria Unggul Wicaksana Prakasa. The time is yours.
I'm sorry, I want to stand up because it's a critical times. Thank you. Good afternoon for all. First, I would like thank you for Mr. Herlambang Wiratraman as a first author, and also as a steering committee of Indonesian Caucus on Academic Freedom, will be guide us to promote and supportive strengthening of academic freedom in Indonesia. It's not only in Indonesia especially, but also in Southeast Asia. We are present regarding the papers, academic freedom and its movement in Indonesian digital authoritarianism. This topic is very interesting because the current situation about democracy and academic freedom in Indonesia is very, in the reality, in the last few years, having a setback conditions. Why? Because the president of Indonesia, Joko Widodo, show how attacks on campus and academic have continued and even increasing. Higher education policies are increasingly politicized by power holders, which take not accountability for attacks on academic and academic activities. The situation is with the repressive is more danger after post reform era. Administrative have a record of numerous regressive political governance model, democratic setback and regression. I think every scholars in around the world have some point of the current situation of democracy in Indonesia, having a democracy setback, democracy regression, illiberal democracy and each other. Well, in the same times, Nadiem Makarim as a Ministry of Education in Indonesia, which seems to herald wins to no change in higher education. The concept of freedom of campus or Merdeka Belajar is most problems to higher education in Indonesia. Why? This conception did not actually address the basis element of academic freedom as a prerequisite for the development of higher education institutions. Therefore, this article argued that in anti-science power structures, science is used only as a political accessory, seen in the action of certain intellectual and even form pro-democratic activity in the political bureaucracy maneuver. Academic freedom in post-Suharto, we can see in the four model, the repressions. For the first, the absence of legal protections as well as meaningful discourage on academic freedom. I think, yes. And the second, acts of violence including threatened campus with physical attacks and legal actions. And the third, how to entrenchment of the legality of feudalism, insularity and the discipline of freedom took over bureaucratizations. And the fourth, state-sponsored commercialization and higher education or McDonaldization of campus. Indonesian Caucus on Academic Freedom in 2022, seeing the models of a repression of academic freedom in Indonesia. For the first, how to cyber attack for academic activity, such as we can call Ananda Badudu, or we can call any several academicians who have criticized for the government have become the jail or the sentencing, the law. The repression campus took an authorities. Third, the silencing of criticized of Papua referendum case. And the fourth, repression of the activism and controversial regulations such as bill of omnibus. And the fifth, threat of violence and terror and unfair trial effort for lecturers, researchers, and students against academic who criticize corrupt government policies. This operation of the authoritarianism regime cannot be separate from the support of oligarch groups. Winters, we know that in the books of oligarchy, we can making some definition. Oligarch who enjoy the privilege of permits and support by greatly investment with aim to getting of maximum profit and deny to protection for human rights, to protection of sustainable development and each other. So, next. Next. Maybe this article will discuss these following questions. For the first, how has academic freedom at campus been shaped by Indonesian authoritarian politics and current issues on digital power? And the second, how academic freedom has been influenced and easily attacked in the rise of digital authoritarianism. With an interdisciplinary approach to understanding why the complexity of these problems. Next. So if we can discuss how the strategy to support of academic freedom in Indonesia, Kika and Scholar at Risk in the fourth review cycle at UN Human Rights Council capture how the strengthening of authoritarianism politics and this challenging for the protection of academic freedom in Indonesia, such as scholars were subjected to criminal and civil legal actions, the controversially information transaction or ITA law, for expression critical of the government, and offering expertises in legal proceeding, students frequently face arrest and policies violence for protecting injustice and decrying corruptions, as well as university disciplinary action for raising apparently conventional, questionable and ideas, and also incidents that raise serious concern over the student, academic freedom, and free expression rights. Next. If we can refer the standards about how the protection of academic freedom, so we can refer into the Article 19 for ICCPR as academic freedom are embedded as a part of the right to freedom of expressions. The rights shall include freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kind. Also into the Article 13 into International Convention for Economic, Social, Cultural Rights as a part of the right of education. Academic freedom including the liberty of individuals to express freely opinion about the institution or system in which they work, to fulfill their functions without discrimination or fear of repression by the state or any other actors. In Indonesian law, we also refer into the constitution. Why this is important? Because into the regulation and the reality is different. It's different. How the academic freedom has been more fragile to repression by any other actors. So the constitution, next, into the Article 28C, 28A, and 28.5, then Indonesian law into number 12 or 2012, or higher education law in Article 8 and Article 9, is also refer about academic freedom. And Surabaya Principles on Academic Freedom in 2017 adapt into National Human Rights Commission Standard and Norm number 5 in 2021. So, several cases we can find about how academic freedom repressions. Next, the college, Robertus Robert, maybe you know, after joking the military song, he was facing repressions and accused of incitement, especially in ITA law and criminal code in Indonesia. Why academic freedom in Indonesia is still weak and also facing the complexity problems? Next. Because academia will facing form of violence such as physical assault, violence of dissolution of discussion or seminars, especially in a sensitive issue, such as the communist issue, such as the Papua issue, and any other sensitive issue. And then how book banning. We are living into the situation of anti-intellectual era. This is the most problems to protect of academic freedom and democracy. John Dewey in the past before maybe remind us how the importance of academic freedom to protection of democracy. Because if scholars are not criticized of the government policy, maybe we can, in the trapping of situation, the worst situation of the authoritarianism regime. And then of a discipline, excessive bureaucratic, lawsuit, and criminalization. We know that Mr. Basuki Wasis, Professor Basuki Wasis, has no jail about the expert into the court about the corruption cases. And any other scholars who facing of academic freedom repression. And next, scientists and authorities and power come big problem because the use of intellectual by supporting anti-scientist science policies. Why is this bastion of academic freedom so fragile? If we remind before that the position of campus and academicians has a bastion of freedom. So this is come to be scientists are closely to the government or closely to the big power has come or has created a manipulation the truth and deny with the honestly and integrity. This is the most problem in the academician itself. So for the last, what's possible movement for academic freedom? We started continuously promoting Surabaya principles on academic freedom in 2017. More spreadly, it's not only for Indonesia, but also into the more widely regions, such as in Sihern, Sepaham, and how the academic freedom in the Surabaya principles and academic freedom has been promoted. The continuously establishing progressive alliance in KIKA, or Caucus Indonesian of Academic Freedom. For the first, we know that KIKA has a victim alliance of the academic freedom represents. But now we can move into the how to supporting and promoting of academic freedom is more widely. It's not only for the lecturers, but also into the students, researchers, and also any academicians into the more widely.
2 minutes left.
Yes, adopt academic principles and freedom as basic rights and freedoms through the advocacy, including expanding strategic by supporting the establishment of SPK or Indonesian Academician Union or Indonesian Campus Union and national-based university union, receiving complaints, making support, and its strategic advocacy, actively participate in solidarity into the network of a civil society. Finally, academic freedom has been affected by stronger control of authoritarianism regime, including in digital spheres. Hence, it's also how the human rights instrument could defend academic freedom in general, while at the same time there will be politics of lie and the fight against digital authoritarianism in Indonesia is most a problem. So we are waiting to support for us how to promote and more stringent about academic freedom in campus. And very lastly, we are also waiting for the positive feedback for this paper for future better. Thank you so much for your attention. Good evening.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have to do so quickly. In this, I will open for the Q&A session. In this Q&A session, I will open up to 3 questions to discuss, and the question can be directed to any of the speakers, or the question is perhaps even answered by all of the 4 speakers. Any question? Okay.
Thank you for the 4 presenters. All of your presentations are thought-provoking. I have some questions in related to Dipa's and Mas Mirza's presentation. I think they're more like connecting to each other, where Dipa is rejecting the notion of digital authoritarianism and suggesting instead technological state and predatory state. And Mas Mirza was using the digital authoritarianism as the context for the threat to academic freedom, right? I think the 2 can be in conversation, of course, but I think it is important also to give the clarification of the concepts you're using. Digital authoritarianism, it could be you two are referring to the same thing, but it's just a different context, and the question of how is then important. Like what Dipa was suggesting, Amir technological state, but Amir was developing the theory based on the authoritarianism context. So he's not rejecting authoritarianism, and if you, I mean, this is my readings of that. Well, he is referring to digital technological authoritarianism in a way. So, and the predatory state is more used for the context of economic politics. So, and while Mas Mirza perhaps can use that in a sense of liberal frameworks of how academic freedoms is then be useful or in context on that. But I have a question with Mas Mirza, and it's really bothering me because I have also similar questions to the context of the activism. When you say academic freedom is in threat, but there has always been academics in the regime. How would you define that? How did you explain that? Like currently with this regime where you mention the authoritarianism, authoritarian regime, all the ministries and advisors and everything are coming from UGM, from UI, from UNPAD, from ITB, IPB. So how would you explain that? With our Filipinos colleagues, I have only one question. Thank you for sharing. My research also related to transitional justice. So I've also read some of the context from your country. I have a question. You said, well, you've had 2 truth commissions. One is set up in 2010, and the other one is for the Bangsamoro one, just recently. And they have had the reports. And you also have reparation programs. So I was just wondering, how is it that you've had these measures for transitional justice, but you still have these issues of retenance and this dominant narrative of the Marcos? Is it possible that it is also the case in Indonesia where we don't have accountability because there is no one being punished for the past wrongdoings? Is that the same case or not? Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, for the next question, please. Oh yeah, Mas Rian.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Rian from Universitas Jember. Since Bong Bong won the last election, and then just recently, if I'm not mistaken, he removed the People Power Day. Yeah, and then I would like to know, I'm curious how the Filipinos remembering the Samar and also Malisbong tragedy. I mean, how such rampant human rights violation are being remembered in the, some kind of collective memory in the Philippines. Thank you.
Okay. Any question again? Okay, I think it's enough. Maybe Bapak Dipa, you can answer the question from first question.
Okay, thank you, Mbak Lewe, for the comments. Yeah, I think it's something that I'm still trying to figure out how to, what kind of concept, what kind of the theory of the state or the concept of the state that is more fitting in this context. Because I was responding mostly when I mentioned the digital authoritarianism, I was responding to the literature that used the concept of digital authoritarianism, but mostly discuss it in the term of freedom of speech, legalism, and it's missing the digital infrastructure or digital architecture analysis. And it's more tied to the notion of authoritarian turn instead of seeing it as in a long duty kind of way. That it's not discontinuity from previous kind of modes of governance. So yeah, I will think more about it. I don't have any response at the time, but I'm thinking how to focus more on the political economic aspect as mentioned by Mas Mudofir when he discussed the predatory politics. But I still have to figure out how to combine these two. Thank you. Yeah, and I would be grateful if there's any of your feedback. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bapak Dipa. Maybe from second speakers.
I guess Kite would be able to answer the first question. Then I'll just add.
Yeah. So yes, there have been efforts, right, with the Philippine state in 2013. That was when they acknowledged that they're accountable for the Marcos regime's human rights violations. And as also mentioned, after their whole intake process, which concluded and distribution process, there were 11,103 people recognized by the state. That's not to say, though, that those are all of the victims of martial law, considering that there is a difficulty in obtaining documentation from a lot of the victims of incidences themselves. And also there was a Bangsamoro Transitional Justice and Reconciliation Commission. In fact, during the listening processes which they conducted, the Malisbong incident surfaced across several of the sessions that were held, especially the one that was done in the village itself, where the mosque was situated. So I would think that a large factor for why we have a junior as a president now, among other things, I could think of two. One being that there is a very large apparatus that backs the Marcoses for their political resurgence, and that also probably has sources in the ill-gotten wealth, which has yet to be actually retrieved from the family. No? And second, I think it's also important to consider that these efforts and commissions we've had so far, I think they address more the aspect of truth, or in finding truth to the incident and the story of the victims, but not necessarily for the justice or prosecution of the perpetrators. Until now, there hasn't been a person who was part of the military operation that committed the Malisbong massacre. Not one of them, to my knowledge, has been prosecuted for that incident yet. And yeah, I think that also goes in a bit into the second question as to why the remembering of the martial law period is also something contested in public spaces. As Sir Viernes mentioned, there is the idea of conflicting memories, given that not everyone may have experienced martial law the same way that others did. Perhaps you might want to add.
Maybe also to tie with the second question, I think what's lacking with the truth commissions in the Philippines is that it's only on the side of the victims. No, seldom we actually try to get narratives from the perpetrator themselves. And in most cases, known perpetrators would often deny that they partook in these incidents. So for example, as I've mentioned earlier, one of the presidential candidates in the Philippines in the last election, Panfilo Lacson, was actually an intelligence officer during that time who actually handles torture. But he can so willingly deny that he did not participate in these tortures, even though you have actually evidence that he's a top member, a high-ranking officer within these institutions. And partly on the second question, it's really unfortunate that the current president, Bongbong Marcos, did not made the EDSA People Power Revolution as a holiday. Since 1987, we recognize February 25 as a national holiday as part of the democratization process in the Philippines. But in the next year, or in the coming years maybe, we won't be having that. So that's a big blow, especially on the memorialization of what happened during this period. But partly, I think there are several reasons why we have Bongbong as president. No? First one, I think we can tie it with the other two presentation, the presence of a troll network in the Philippines, or a disinformation network. And I think both the previous and the current president of the Philippines actually benefited from this kind of network. And in large part, these networks would disseminate ideas or notions of historical distortions, or even denying killings or corruption during the martial law years, and would even provide alternatives. So in the Philippines, the typical discourse would be, it's either the years were the dark ages or it's actually the golden age. Thus in my presentation earlier, I showed a slide on the smiling martial law, because it's the thing that most people actually remembers when we talk about the Marcoses. So when we ask people, especially the younger generations, what do you know about the Marcos? They would often suggest the buildings and infrastructure built by the Marcoses rather than talking about the killings that happened during the period. And these kinds of discourses would be typically taken by troll accounts on the different social media pages. So for the younger generations, they would be exposed to this. No? Another layer would be the experiences of their parents. For one, for example, a personal anecdote. Both my parents, my mother and father, actually benefited from Marcos during his regime. Okay? So in the Philippines, we have the notion of the solid north. Okay? It's the bailiwick, the electoral bailiwick of Marcos. So people living in the north would only vote for Marcos regardless of the narrative. So my father, who came from that area, we had a debate. It was a very emotional debate during the election. So we were discussing, why would you vote for a killer, a liar, so on and so forth. Then he would defend his position, saying that without Marcos and the declaration of martial law, we could have lost our farm because of the presence of the communists in the area. So you have these kinds of experiences. And I think these experiences still proliferates, most especially with the older generation. And for a country who deeply respects its elders, it's really hard to contest these kinds of narratives coming from them. And lastly, I think the failure of the educational system in the Philippines has also something to do with the return of the Marcoses in power. Just a quick note, after Marcos was removed from power in 1986, 6 years after that, his wife, Imelda Marcos, actually ran for presidency. And without the other candidates, she could have actually won. So it's not just this time. No? Even 6 years after 1986, we already have this problem in the Philippines.
Okay. For Satria Unggul.
Thank you. I think the only one for me, the question regarding what the most problem of higher education, and especially for the authoritarian regime. If we see the root cause problems in the Indonesia higher educations, I think it is because how the tradition of feudalism, insularity, and bureaucratic in higher education is the most problem to making more scholars who trapping into the practices of corruptions or dishonest and also did not protect of ecology and each other. So I think we have two suggest in the short term and long term. For the short term, maybe we must check how and tracking especially how the next successor of the government of Indonesia, I think Indonesia in the few months, in the future months, making elections, I think we must to check and control by the peoples of Indonesia to making the successor is more better. And the long term, I think how to making more higher educational policies more reconstruct to making more better of the scholars itself. I think Mr. Herlambang.
Okay. Thank you, Pak Satria, because the time is up. Okay. I'm so sorry because I can mark or highlight in this presentation today. Once again, thank you for our four best participants in this afternoon, and I also thank you a lot for all of the participants in this panel, and I hope it will be beneficial for all of us. So once again, I'm Bahjah Bakta. Thank you so much.